Okay, the culture and society in the Roman world. The objectives are: 1. Discuss how Roman culture and society were heavily influenced by the Greeks. And 2nd, relate how the Romans spread both Greek and Roman contributions throughout the empire. So here we're transitioning into art and architecture, culture, and society. Now, the Romans had largely adopted many features of the Greek style of art. Remember, early on with Greek colonial efforts in the south of Italy and Sicily, we see that the Greek society, language, writing, all of those things transitioned and emerged into the Roman context. And so we see then the Romans, after they've conquered the Greeks, take what was the Greeks and bring it into a Roman context. So you see reproductions of Greek statues. These became increasingly popular once the supply of original works ran low. And so many people, of course, wanted and fancied to have Greek statues and sculptures on their territories. But obviously, we're talking about the wealthy elite. And so reproductions were quite popular. It was quite the thing to have a Greek replica. And the Greek aimed for the ideal, but the Romans really aimed for the realistic, even if it was unpleasant. The Greeks, of course, when they carved or depicted a person, they sought the perfect human, the perfect form. But the Romans didn't. We also see a major shift. The Romans, of course, saw the ideal beauty in the woman's form versus the form of the male that the Greeks had believed. So we see a major shift in that as well. Now, other forms of architecture and art cropped up in the Roman Empire as well. The vault, the arch, the dome, all of these things were major innovations architecturally for the Roman Empire. Now, where this becomes possible is through the use of concrete. Now, concrete was used en masse all over the Roman Empire and makes really all of this possible. Aqueducts built all over the place, a network of 50,000 miles of road, all of this possible through the major architectural transformations of the Roman world. We also see a golden age emerge in Roman literature. Now, this golden age of Latin literature was in the age of Augustus. We see an explosion of examples of high Latin, Roman art through literature and Latin writing. Virgil, of course, is a major example of this. Virgil, the son of a small landholder in northern Italy near Mantua, he is most famous for writing the Aeneid, which is the ideal Roman characterized through his adventures, Aeneas, through his adventures leaving Troy. And so this became an ideal for duty, piety, faithfulness. What we should see here is a similarity to the function of the Iliad and how the Iliad was used as a tool to characterize and show the ideal Greek man and how one should behave. The Aeneid functions in a similar manner. We also see examples of this in Horace. Horace pointed out the vices of his age in his satires, made fun of all sorts of people in his comical, poetic verse. Livy is the most famous Latin prose writer of the time, writing the history of Rome, and he wrote in terms of moral lessons, but focused on the greatness of Rome, and the moral lessons translated into to Roman people living up to the legacy that was Rome and the greatness of what Rome was founded upon. And so these are some of the major transitions in this golden age in Latin. We also see an emphasis on the Roman family. We see this in literature, and we see this in architecture, sculpture. At the heart of the Roman social structure stood the family, and this was headed by the pater familias, that is, usually a male head of the family. And this was a patriarchal society, of course, and we have a veneration of ancestors, and particularly male ancestors. So Romans raised their children at home, and teachers were often Greek slaves, teaching them Greek and teaching them Latin. Of course, we're talking about the wealthy here. And Roman boys learned reading, writing, law, physical training, which is a legacy from the Greeks, both physical bodies that were well chiseled and able to be strong military men, but also keen minds. Both were needed. Both were emphasized. Here, of course, in this sculpture, we see a man standing with the busts of his ancestors. So the ancestors are important. The family members, particularly the male family members, are important to be remembered and revered, which of course is an interesting parallel to Han China and the ancestral worship and veneration. Now, what was the attitude toward women? The weakness of females made it necessary for women to have male guardians. That was the concept, that not only to protect their own virtue from their own quote-unquote tendency toward vice, but also to protect them from other male vices and to protect the integrity of the woman. Now, for females were often married between 12 and 14, and men, of course, married much later. Now, why is this the case? Most ancient people actually married very early on, somewhere around 12 to 14. Why? Because it was seen in the ancient context as what was natural. By the time a woman reached menstruation, when she reached maturity, she was considered a woman and therefore able to bear children. And when she could bear children, she should be married, because one of the major goals of Roman marriage was to have children and to produce good citizens. Of course, we can see a similarity in Han China there. Now, Roman marriages were meant for life. Now, divorce, of course, did occur and eventually was introduced and accepted, but marriage and marriage for life was considered a prime virtue for the Roman. And this, of course, is connected not only to a strong Roman society, politically, socially, but also translated into issues of property. Now, both parties could initiate divorce, not just males. So this isn't an absolute oppressive patriarchal society, though the question becomes what is and isn't oppressive. But certainly women operating within this society knew no different, and of course, having lived in the society, believed it was what it was. They wouldn't think anything else of it. And so then, we inevitably see, however, in the long run, changing roles when it comes to gender. By the 2nd century CE, the paterfamilias no longer had absolute power. Prior to this, the paterfamilias, the male leading family member, was in complete control of the family. In fact, it was even said in some cases that the very life of those in the family was controlled. In fact, even in classical Roman society, the father could doom his kids to Hades if they misbehaved. And so we have many cases of this, but by the time we get to the 2nd century CE, this had largely eroded in Roman society. Men could no longer sell their children into slavery if they wished. They could no longer doom their kids to hell in any sort of true sense. So we see that sort of shift in society. Perhaps some have equated to the introduction of Christianity into the Roman world. It's unclear. However, upper-class Roman women in the early empire had considerable freedom and were not segregated from the males as it was among the normal class. And so we see, as is the case in most societies. The wealthy elite have more liberties than those who are of lower social and economic standing. Now then, the major question, which is an important issue, is slavery. We addressed this in the Greek world, and now we need to address this in the Roman context. Slavery was common throughout the ancient world. It is not unique to Romans. It is not unique to the Greek. It is not unique anywhere. It is certainly not unique to the American context. Slavery has always existed. Does that mean that it is moral or ethical? Certainly not. A small Roman farmer might possess 1 or 2 slaves, and the rich would have many slaves, as one might expect. However, what we need to be clear on is that these slaves are not based on race in the sense of skin color or anything like that. It was largely based on conquest and a non-Roman status. Large numbers were captured in different wars. Many Gallic soldiers and refugees were slaves throughout the Roman Empire. Many Greeks were slaves. It is not anyone with any particular skin color. And in fact, many were released into their own freedom. And in some cases, odd as it may be, some of the wealthy, educated Greek slaves liked being slaves for their families. Why? Because they began to be connected to the families and became part of the families. And in fact, when their time to be released from slavery, many refused to leave the families. Does this mean that this is monolithic and true of all situations and all peoples? Certainly not. Certainly not. And many gladiators, of course, are slaves, and many would rather be free and back in Gaul or wherever they came from. So this is not a justification of slavery, but an explanation. So slaves served as tutors, musicians, doctors, artists, cooks, valets, waiters, cleaners, gardeners, you name it, there was a slave for it. And in most cases, most slaves wore a collar. Now this, of course, seems quite barbaric and seems kind of a thrust of animal status upon humans, because, of course, in our context, collars are only worn by animals, dogs, pets. But this was, of course, not the context. It was a means by which to identify whose property they belonged to. But this isn't a sort of chattel property, like as if someone were a cow or something. Now, slaves built roads and public buildings and farmed large estates for the wealthy. And so the slavery is a complex issue that, but certainly it can be said that the Roman society was built upon the backs of slaves. And it's a very important concept, but I invite you to do a little more research if you're interested. Now, some slaves, of course, revolted against their owners. All right, they didn't want to be owned, as is understandable. But the most famous slave revolt in Italy occurred in 73 BCE, and this was led by the gladiator Spartacus. Now, despite the popularization through TV shows and films, Spartacus was largely unsuccessful, and I'm sure it was certainly an incredible revolt, but it was not as successful or as bloody or as sensual as some TV shows have made it out to be. He, of course, managed to defeat several Roman armies with his massive slave army and slave rebellion, and he inevitably, however, was trapped and killed in 71 BCE, and he was crucified along with 6,000 of his followers. Now, crucifixion was no thing to laugh at. It was a big deal. Now, what you see on your screen here is one of the only archaeological remains of someone who was crucified. Why do we not have any archaeological remains? Because usually those who were crucified were slaves and the poor, and were thrown into common ditches, and were, of course, very few remains have ever been found. Here you see a nail driven through the bone, the ankle bone of this person. Now, crucifixion was invented by the Persians and was perfected by the Romans as a perfect form of torture. In fact, in some cases, people have been known to live through the crucifixion process up to a week. Most historians tend to believe that crucifixion really resulted in suffocation, that one suffocated as a result of crucifixion. It wasn't through blood loss, but through exhaustion, exposure to elements, and so forth. Now, what did daily life in Rome look like? What were the living conditions in Rome? Now, Rome had the largest population of any city in the empire, somewhere around 1 million in total. Rome was overcrowded, noisy, carts and wagons constantly created traffic. I mean, imagine LA in the ancient context, in an ancient way. However, imagine that though a complex sewer network, though quite civilized in terms of technological innovation, people still threw their filth out onto the street. They threw their filth from upper story windows. The rich had, of course, comfortable villas and comfortable living, but for the average person, that was not the case. The poor lived in apartment blocks called insulae, and these apartment complexes were owned by the wealthy elite, and they paid rent. Though, catch this, there was no bathroom in there for anyone. It was only the wealthy who had their own private bathrooms. One had to go to the public restrooms. Now, of course, in this ancient context, fire was a constant threat. In fact, there was a massive fire in 64 CE. It was blamed on Nero. Nero was blamed for burning Rome, or in turn he blamed the Christians for it. It's unclear what happened, but it's no surprise that a massive fire occurred. High rent forced many to live in one room, which was really a death trap in this context. But high rents, as the wealthy drove up prices for apartments, led to just bleaker living conditions for the average Roman. Now, what were the public programs like? I mean, there were public temples, public marketplaces, bathhouses, theaters. Emperors provided food for the city poor. There was entertainment freely available. Entertainment was provided on a grand scale for the inhabitants of Rome, largely through circus and through gladiatorial events. Public spectacles were provided by the emperor as part of a great religious festival celebrated by the state to laud various accomplishments of the emperor and of Rome itself. The most famous example of some of this entertainment was the Circus Maximus, which was horse and drawn chariot races that would compete against each other and attracted hundreds of thousands of people, if not for the free bread being tossed out, at least for the blood and gore that inevitably emerged as chariots vied for victory and attacked and killed one another like a gladiatorial sort of event. And so this is commonly referred to as bread and circus, a means by which the emperor and the ruling elite could control the minds and the people of the average everyday citizen. The idea was, there's problems, so let's distract them with entertainment. Let's distract them with food. Let's distract them with all of these various feel-good ideas and things. So then, the objectives were, 1, discuss how Roman culture and society were heavily influenced by the Greeks. We saw this through the exposure of art and architecture and language. And second, relate how the Romans spread both Greek and Roman contributions throughout the empire, the Roman network system, the aqueducts. And so all of those led to the spreading of the Greek and Roman technical and scientific and architectural and artistic traditions throughout the world.